So good afternoon and welcome to this talk by Amita Bhaviskar, who you're all delighted to have here. Amita needs absolutely no introduction, especially in Delhi. But I'll go through the formal motions as we wait for more people to come in. She's currently Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth. Her earlier work on Narmada and then on Delhi's own environmentalism, and now she's moved to working on the relationship between food and culture. And that's what she's going to be speaking about today in terms of the impact that industrial foods have on our cultural identities, something that we look forward to with great interest. Amita's, of course, been known for many awards, but I'll just mention one, which is I think the inaugural Infosys Prize in 2010, which was awarded to her for her contributions in sociology. So the field's open. The floor's, Amita, it's about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Is it? Oh, it's not connected. HDMI, no? Isn't it showing up on the screen? Just do that F12, whatever instruction, and then
Thank you, Partho. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk. What I present before you today is still the early stage of a research project on changing diets and agrarian environments in India. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. So this work on food is still very raw. I have assembled some of the ingredients and I have a recipe in mind, but for the cooking of it, I need your help in slicing and dicing, in making it come together, in tasting and improving it with your comments and suggestions. So your feedback is extremely welcome and will be very helpful at this stage. My talk today focuses on the role of processed foods. Specifically, I'm going to be using the device of talking about instant noodles. And I look at the role of processed foods in the political and cultural imagination of Indians across regions, classes, and the rural-urban continuum at the intersection of capitalism and citizenship. Why did I choose to focus on noodles? Noodles in India belong to the category of industrial foods, commodities produced under capital-intensive conditions. Historically, such foods have been a critical part of industrialization and the emergence of a working class detached from the land. And the classic work here is Sidney Mintz's analysis of the incorporation of sugar in diets in Western Europe. Industrial food regimes have also been a major part of Fordist economies of mass production and mass consumption, often backed by a Keynesian social contract on the part of the state. Equally pertinent in the Indian context is their defining feature of being free from the association with any specific community or region, marked only by the brand of modernity. Yet there's virtually no social science research on the place of industrial foods in Indian diets, nothing akin to Aaron Bobrow-Strain's work on white bread in the US, or Melissa Colwell's work on McDonald's in Moscow, and certainly nothing to match Sidney Mintz's towering tale of sugar across 3 continents, bringing together slavery, the plantation economy, and European working class diets. And while food studies have come into their own in the Anglo-American Academy, scholars of India haven't yet shown a sustained interest in contemporary food practices. The scholarship that does exist has tended to engage with that enduring anthropological concern, the Hindu principle of purity of pollution, as it applies to social relations. Food and marriage transactions, what in Hindi is called roti beti vyavhar, organized around the purity pollution opposition, have of course affected what one eats, with whom and where, not just among Hindus but among others on the subcontinent. But this matrix of purity pollution has become less and less relevant for understanding contemporary diets. My own approach to food studies comes from a different trajectory, and that is a long-standing concern with the cultural politics of environment and development in India, with social movements that assert claims to land, water, and forests, with the everyday resistance of an urban underclass in search of secure homes and stable jobs. Along with other students of Indian history, politics, and culture, my view of the last 100 years has been structured around defining events such as the anti-colonial nationalist movement, partition and independence in 1947, developmentalism since the 1950s, and economic liberalization since the 1990s. These chronologies, momentous as they are, so strongly shape our imagination of the past and the present that it's an intellectual and political challenge to look back across the long Indian century and ask what other genealogies, transitional moments, and trajectories may come into view once we loosen hold of these older narrative arcs. One of the significant trajectories that remains understudied in Indian political life is the shaping of citizenship by capitalism. To be sure, we have analysis of how capitalism in India shapes state action. I'm thinking here of the work that begins with Suzanne Rudolph and Lloyd Rudolph and Pranab Bardhan. We also have studies of how contemporary capitalism causes the displacement and dispossession of India's poorest citizens, for instance, the writings of Kalyan Sanyal, and Felix Padel and Samarendra Das, most recently Mike Levian. And we have studies of how capitalism reshapes work and labor relations. The work of Jonathan Parry, Gert de Neve, and Jamie Cross comes to mind. In addition, there are studies of capitalism that focus on its globalizing aspect, such as by Arjun Appadurai, including work by William Mazzarella that explicitly addresses the issue of mass consumerism, which is the subject of my presentation today. All these aspects of capitalism in India have implications for citizenship in its different dimensions. As the political scientist Neerja Jayal puts it, citizenship as legal status, citizenship as a bundle of rights and entitlements, and citizenship as a sense of identity and belonging. Yet, these aspects of capitalism tell us little about how it shapes practices of citizenship in ways that are relatively unmediated by the state and outside the domain of work and production. Everyday encounters with capitalism, those where its normalizing and totalizing effects are experienced and resisted, occur not only in the sphere of production but also in the realm of consumption and reproduction. Citizenship, too, is produced and performed not only in the sphere of formal politics but also through the media, popular culture, and everyday life. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the volume edited by Chris Fuller and Veronique Benet and a recent book by Akhil Gupta. To understand how political economy and citizenship converge and conflict, it's necessary that we also focus on everyday life in its apparent ordinariness, on the secular changes that have gradually but thoroughly transformed identity and belonging in India. So in this talk, I propose that one of the trajectories of the long Indian century that illuminates a relationship between political economy and citizenship is that of changes in food practices. In particular, the increasing incorporation of industrial foods into Indian diets is a telling index of the presence and power of specific forms of capitalism in shaping the substance of citizenship. We know that eating is an everyday practice that fulfills a basic biological and social need within an ecologically and culturally defined context. At the same time, Eating food is a way of expressing one's sense of self, individually and collectively, in relation to the past, present, and future. These expressions of identity and belonging are preeminently social, not only in their content, but also in the contexts in which they occur. At the same time, they speak most intimately to desires and fears, aspirations and vulnerabilities. As Alfred Gell points out, consumption involves the incorporation of the consumed item into the personal and social identity of the consumer. Food, therefore, offers a core area in which to trace modes of social being and belonging, exclusion and inclusion. The majority of Indians in urban and rural settings are net purchasers of food, compelled to deal with food as in its commodity form. They also buy some essential food items at subsidized prices from government-controlled public distribution system outlets, but the bulk of consumption is sourced directly from the market. This embeds people within complex networks of production, processing, and distribution, characterized by multiple forms of property ownership and organization. So my talk traces the growing presence of one distinctive category of commodities, namely industrial foods. I borrowed this term industrial foods from Jack Goody, who used it to refer to mass-manufactured food commodities produced using capital-intensive technologies and distributed usually by corporate firms. Now, industrially produced commodities have, of course, long figured in Indian households across the social spectrum. Radios, bicycles, wristwatches, and textiles were among the durable goods that spread throughout the country in the first half of the 20th century. However, diets remained relatively impervious to such transformation for a long time. Even those foods that were processed outside the home, such as oil, rice, and pulses, were locally sourced. As historian Elizabeth Collingham reports, tea and sugar were among the few industrially processed items of consumption to be incorporated into Indian diets early on, and the demand for branded commodities such as glucose biscuits and powdered milk and infant formula rose after the Second World War. Dry rations supplied to troops stationed in India during the Second World War also circulated in the civilian market. Incidentally, the institutionalization of widespread rationing during the war laid the groundwork for the post-independence PDS system of subsidized food quotas which continues into the present. This and other features of the centralized command economy put in place during the war, which were continued under Nehruvian socialism, have led historian Indivar Kamtekar to suggest that World War II should be accorded more attention in India as a critical event on par with the nationalist movement and partition. In many ways, the development in the US and in Europe of food technologies directed towards provisioning troops, such as industrial-scale canning, fortification of food with synthetic nutrients, and the subsequent redeployment of wartime industries for peacetime food production, such as munitions factories re-engineered to produce synthetic fertilizers, played a major role in shaping food production and consumption in India and the rest of the colonized world. The work of Timothy Mitchell and Michael Pollan traces some of these neglected links between war and peace, guns and butter. Now industrial foods are an increasingly central part of diets across the subcontinent, and according to National Sample Survey data, the share of processed foods in total food consumption has risen across all classes, including among the poorest. So processed foods allow us a vantage point to re-examine the idea of the nation as imagined economy, to use Satish Deshpande's term. In the post-colonial context, this concept, nation as imagined economy, has primarily been used to study planned intervention by the developmental state with a view to expanding production, the establishment of heavy industries and infrastructure, and the accompanying rise of a techno-managerial bureaucracy. But less attention has been paid to the simultaneous expansion of commodity circulation, especially of industrially manufactured consumer goods, from home appliances and mobile phones to clothes and cosmetics, as an equally important mode of constituting citizenship. The spread of these goods has, however, only grown in significance in the post-liberalization period, as the developmental discourse of austerity and deferred consumption has been replaced by a celebration of consumerist gratification. Within the widening circuits of consumption, processed food commodities demand analysis because of their ubiquity. They form an increasing part of diets across India, and distinctiveness, that they appear neutral in a Hindu-dominated cultural matrix renowned for the formidable complexity of its dietary rules based on caste, religion, and region. The consumption practices they engender are productive sites for imagining citizenship cutting across social hierarchies, creating new identities and diluting stigmatized ones. Even as poor Indians struggle to secure access to basic food, evident in the Right to Food campaign, an area of extensive research and activism. You could think of the work, for instance, of Ritika Kheda, Jean Drez, and Harsh Mandar. Poor citizens also attempt to include more processed foods in their diets, a tendency that shows the significance of these commodities in the politics of social inclusion and exclusion. The connections between state subsidized basic foods and privately produced processed foods are complicated. Kerala, for instance, reports consistently high offtake of wheat through its PDS ration shops, a curious fact in a rice-eating state. It turns out that the subsidized wheat is actually siphoned off and sold to private bakeries that make biscuits and bread, popular processed foods that cater to the growing demand from low-end consumers. So let me now turn to noodles. Walking along Chhatra Marg, the main road through the Delhi University campus, one comes across pavement vendors selling not only long-time Indian snacks such as peanuts or bhel puri or chaat, but Maggi noodles. College canteens and restaurants that students frequent may still have samosas and bread pakoras, but their popularity has been eclipsed by Maggi. Elsewhere in India, a scenic lookout point on the road to the hill resort of Mussoorie, known for decades as Sunset Point, has now been renamed Maggi Point because that's why one now goes there to look at the sunset while eating Maggi. Talking to college students in Guwahati, Chidambaram, and Allahabad, I'm struck by how many said that Maggi was their favorite food. Some said that they can't go a day without eating Maggi. Restaurants serve Maggi dosa, Maggi sandwiches, Maggi milkshakes, indicating the emergence of a vibrant fusion. Maggi acts like a faluda, sort of, yeah. Maggi sandwiches, Maggi milkshakes, Maggi dosa, in indicating the emergence of a vibrant fusion cuisine. In her book Armies, Wars and Their Food, Vijay Rao describes something called the Siachen Omelette, cooked by soldiers stationed 20,000 feet above sea level on the Siachen Glacier along the contested border with Pakistan, often described as the world's highest battlefield. The Siachen omelette is made of powdered eggs, stuffed with cooked Maggi noodles, two of the only foodstuffs that can survive at that altitude. In a survey of midday meals served in government-run primary schools in Delhi, children said that they didn't want to eat rajma chawal or chole chawal, the nutritious foods that they are usually served. They wanted noodles. Now, unbranded noodles are popular across social classes in urban and rural India. Rickshaw pullers in a busy retail market in Delhi crowd around a chow mein cart, twirling strands of noodles slippery with oil and soya sauce onto forks. Workers at construction sites in Bihar and Odisha do the same. In urban bastis and in small rural towns, 5 rupee packets of Maggi make it possible to occasionally, and for some others regularly, indulge in this treat, one that is advertised on television by no less a national icon than the megastar Amitabh Bachchan. So what is going on? How has a food virtually unknown to the vast majority of Indians a generation ago become so ubiquitous across the country? How has a particular brand of this food, Maggi as manufactured by Nestle, managed to capture millions of Indians' imagination in terms of what they like to eat, what they eat, who they are, and who they want to be? How has Maggi become, as Mumbai-based advertising expert Kiran Khalap said, the third staple of Indian food after wheat and rice? What is the success of Maggi, a brand name synonymous with noodles in India, tell us about the changing contours of social inequality and aspirations in the country? So I analyzed the phenomenal popularity of instant noodles through the concept of consumer citizenship, or how the social life of things, to use Arjun Appadurai's term, of objects of consumption, such as mobile phones in Asa Doran and Robin Jeffrey's study, opens up unintended and unexpected political possibilities. And here I examine citizenship not as a purely political concept of relationships based on rights between the state and citizens, but as a social and economic concept focused on belonging within the nation, as expressed through practices simultaneously material and symbolic. Scholars have drawn attention to the shifting articulations between constructions of consumer and citizen, arguing that access to consumer goods and the so called freedom to choose was considered a fundamental political right in the West by the middle of the 20th century. Within India, early nationalist constructions of consumption linked the consumer to the exercise of citizenship through the notion of the producer patriot at the service of the nation. The anti-colonial Swadeshi movement politicized the buying of foreign goods to produce a new kind of nationalist consciousness. The Swadeshi movement notably focused on the production and consumption of cloth from cotton grown in India but spun and woven in the mills of Lancashire and imported into India at high tariffs to be sold to Indian consumers. Leading the struggle against colonialism, Mahatma Gandhi urged Indians to boycott this foreign product and fostered in its stead the indigenous economy of khadi, hand-spun, hand-woven cloth, supporting hundreds of thousands of local weavers, keeping their knowledge and skills alive, while challenging the unfair economic relations imposed by the imperial order. Spinning khadi, and Gandhi urged everyone to do so, as a form of embodied work that was also a gesture of solidarity with the weaver, became a symbol of the producer patriot, liberating his or her country through labor. For this movement, the consumption of commodities was linked to an image of the economy as a locus of production in the service of the nation. The elite reformist modernizing middle class, as the vanguard of the new nation, was sometimes imagined as comprising consumers whose practices of consumption were tied to appropriate forms of modern domesticity. Such discourses of consumerism and the ways they were linked to understandings of citizenship within India are marked by debates about westernization, tradition, and modernity generated out of the problematic of colonial and post-colonial nationalist cultural projects. Satish Deshpande has analyzed how the idea of the nation and its citizens has been imagined as an economy after independence through the 5-year plans, through investment in capital-intensive infrastructure, dams, steel plants, nuclear reactors, through the development of dedicated industrial towns like Bhilai, Rourkela, and Bokaro, where the citizen was meant to be a producer patriot. This analysis mainly focused on production and not on the circulation and consumption of commodities. However, consumption, especially of industrially manufactured consumer goods, has emerged as an equally important mode of constituting citizenship. The spread of these goods grew in significance after policies of economic liberalization were instituted in the 1990s and, as I said earlier, when a developmental discourse of austerity and deferred consumption was rapidly displaced by a celebration of consumerist gratification. As William Mazzarella observed, increasingly in India, forms of consumer citizenship in the era of liberalization articulate the citizen through the notion of the right to consume, a right that must be protected through state action. In dominant discourse, the economy is no longer imagined only as a locus of production. It is now more consistently imagined as a marketplace of commodities for consumption. A shift that entails a move away from the idea of the citizen as producer patriot to one of a cosmopolitan consumer. For members of societies being transformed by globalization, consumer practices and discourses have become an increasingly important axis of belonging for negotiating citizenship. In her book on youth and politics in Kerala, anthropologist Ritti Lukos also points out that while the discourse of generational shift from Midnight's children or the developmental generation to liberalization's children rightly focuses on the eclipsing of the Nehruvian vision of a nation within liberalizing India, it obscures more than it reveals when it simply highlights the triumph of consumerism. For members of society that are being transformed by globalization, consumer practices and discourses are an increasingly important axis of belonging for negotiating citizenship. In other words, for the politics of social membership, for negotiation of public life, and for an understanding of politics within the nation." Unquote. Lukos goes on to argue that consumer citizenship is not a depoliticized retreat into private behavior, but is a form of cultural politics with implications for how citizens negotiate public life within and beyond the boundaries of the elite nationalist middle class. So, how is social membership rearticulated through consumer citizenship, more specifically through eating Maggi noodles? The first notable aspect of Maggi consumers in India is that they tend to be young. They're children, adolescents, and young adults. Capturing this demographic slice of India is crucial for the manufacturers of consumer goods. As market analyst Rama Bijapurkar points out, about 7 out of 10 households in India have a liberalization child who acts as a change agent in that household. Children are not just a very attractive niche market opportunity, but are also critical to the mainstream. She goes on to emphasize the mainstream Indian market is a youth market. This resonates with Riti Lucas' study of college students in Kerala, where she points out that the intensification and expansion of consumer flows through the liberalization of the Indian economy have made consumption of goods and mass-mediated images a key site for producing youth identities. The second striking feature of instant noodles consumers is that they are no longer confined to metropolitan and Class A cities. People who live in small towns and large villages eat noodles now, a fact that resonates with Deepankar Gupta's wider analysis of the changing villager. Rural India continues to suffer from serious deprivation in terms of basic amenities. 45% of Indians have no electricity, 70% of rural households have no toilets. But they are growing consumers of manufactured goods, not only durables like mobile phones and motorbikes, but also processed and packaged foods. The share of these foods in the rural households' food basket is rising. NSS data shows that although food still makes up 50 to 65% of the total monthly expenditure of households in rural India, the category now includes larger outlays on tea, glucose biscuits, corn and rice chips, bottled beverages, and noodles. This spread into rural India has not only been made possible by companies investing in their distribution networks, but by innovations in packaging technology. This conjuncture of changing technologies of organization and materials is a significant factor in the spread of industrial foods. For big brand producers of what are called FMCG, or fast-moving consumer goods, such as snacks and cosmetics, like Nestle, Unilever, ITC, and Pepsi, the development of metallized polymer films allows packaging to be eye-catching and airtight, enabling brands to deliver the guarantee of quality that they claim. Metallized polymer films also make it possible to sell small units of processed foods at low prices to those who C.K. Prahalad, the marketing guru, called the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. These shiny packets of corn chips, instant coffee, chewing tobacco, and other products are now ubiquitous in urban and rural markets. In the case of Maggi noodles, the big breakthrough occurred in 2002 when, in response to emerging competition from brands like Nissin's Top Ramen, Nestle decided to sell its instant noodles in 5 rupee packets of 50 grams and to aggressively expand their availability in small towns. Maggi now has a 75% of a 2,500 crore market, growing at 20% annually. The consumers of this new food commodity thus include not only the so-called new middle classes, but also working class people in urban and rural India who can now, in a modest way, enjoy some of the same pleasures as the class above them. In a nation still defined by sharp economic and social disparities, this convergence of consumption styles, similarities in form, if not always in substance or quality, is celebrated in the media through numerous television advertisements that resonate with the aspirations of subaltern classes for upward mobility. These ads also signify that citizenship is about shared national belonging, as constituted through the consumption of mass-manufactured and marketed packaged goods. One Maggi ad, for instance, shows a fisherman in the sea off the Konkan coast in western India and young Tibetan monks in the Himalayas enjoying this national dish. As the data show, processed and packaged foods are proliferating across the class and rural-urban divide among social groups for whom consuming products such as instant noodles and soups would have been previously unthinkable. The association of these foods with modernity is signaled not only by the bright packaging, but also by advertising campaigns that stress convenience and hygiene, while also appealing to the premium placed on instant gratification in the present. But their appeal lies not only in their association with modernity. The slogan, Bas 2 minute, is indeed about instant gratification, but it's also about empowering a mother to immediately satisfy her child's hunger, an enduring cultural value across India and perhaps the world. Another ad shows a girl making Maggie while her mother watches, bristling with disapproval. But the mother's worry is soon replaced by a gratified smile when she sees that her daughter has cooked Maggie exactly the way that she does. So Maggie is now a way of transmitting family tradition, a bond between daughter and mother. For Indian students abroad, 25 to 35-year-olds, the mouth-feel of Maggie noodles, that soft curly form that you suck in, and the unique flavor of the masala taste maker that converts white flour, oils, sugar, and assorted chemical additives into a veritable sensorium, is the stuff of nostalgia and longing, a cultural memory from which they're exiled unless they carry back packets of the stuff in their suitcases. Since 2008, 25 years after Maggie launched in India, the ad campaign about Me and Mera Maggie, with stories from Maggie eaters about how they personalize the dish, consolidates the sensual, sentimental association between the commodity and its consumers. With its emphasis on the sociality around food, the bonding of families and friends, Nestle has taken an unfamiliar food and domesticated it so thoroughly that, as Melissa Colwell observes about McDonald's in Moscow, producers and consumers began blurring the boundaries between the global and the local, the new and the original, through a set of tactics grounded in flexible ideologies of trust, comfort, and intimacy. Unquote. If Maggie has been vernacularized so much that it's a comfort food for millions of Indians, for even more millions, it is a desired taste, a lifestyle aspiration, and even a measure of distinction, as Lozada remarks in his study of KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, in Beijing. Comfort and aspiration, need and want, belonging and striving are the cornerstones of consumer citizenship. However, I want to emphasize that the locus of this noodle-shaped citizenship is national, a cosmopolitan national, but national nonetheless. Unlike Coke, McDonald's, and KFC, the community that Maggie constructs doesn't have a global reference. It isn't held together by the cultural allure of America. Maggie's glamour is anchored in Indian icons and values. At the same time, the claim to represent national identity is a contested one. It was challenged in 2015 by allegations of pesticide contamination in the tastemaker flavoring packet, following which the yoga guru Baba Ramdev, who now runs a fast-growing packaged food, cosmetic, and medicine empire under the Patanjali brand, launched his own so-called natural noodles. So Nestle's cosmopolitan Indian product is confronted by a business rival's claim to a more authentically Indian identity on the rather ironic battleground of instant noodles. One could argue that eating the same product across different social contexts creates a semblance of equality, a shared moment when you're as good as anyone else. In the context of sharp inequalities, is this feeling a consolation, or is the dissonance between this moment and other aspects of one's everyday life where inequality is experienced a provocation? These are open questions. We're all the same, we eat the same food is not a sentiment that has had much success in Indian social life. The emergence of differentiation is already evident with Maggie, because there's now the more expensive whole wheat atta Maggie with vegetables, marketed with the slogan Tasty Bhi or Healthy Bhi, for consumers conscious of the low nutritive value of the product. The idea of Mera Maggie is not just about difference as unity in diversity, but also about distinction and cultural dominance. Embedded as they firmly are in a multinational food industry, one that's been implicated in the explosive growth of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease among children and adolescents, the larger political economy of these products is deeply compromised. One transformation of cultural products, one transformation of cultural politics with which we can certainly credit commodities like instant noodles is the decisive shift in the demographics of power, the creation and affirmation of a youth identity within the household and outside. If one thought that noodles could not be consequential to that shift, one has only to recall Jitendra Chattar, the Khap Panchayat leader from Jind, Haryana, who blamed noodles for causing hormonal imbalance in young men so that they became sexually violent. The widespread derision with which this comment was greeted shows how thoroughly noodles have been incorporated into local diets. Old men may express a fear of foreign foods and frustration at rebellious youth who no longer listen to their elders, but for the younger generation, noodles are here to stay. As the career of instant noodles demonstrates, food is not only to do with nutrition and biological needs, but cultural desires. Even as right to food activists strive to accommodate the diversity of Indian foodways to some extent, such as promoting millets to end the monopoly of wheat and rice, they confront the challenge of a generational shift in what is considered good to eat, moving away from local, more nutritious diets to branded industrial foods of low nutritional value, junk foods. At the same time, for poor people stigmatized by caste and rurality, eating these foods signifies participation in a desired modern lifestyle of being as good as everyone else, so that these foods play an important yet contradictory part in claiming social belonging and equality, which is an intrinsic element of social well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. That was less than the 45 minutes that we expect, and sort of ends on a rather tantalizing note. So